Emeka had always known something felt different about his relationship with Mama Adana, but he could never quite put his finger on what it was. At 25, he was successful, running a thriving electronics business in Lagos, yet whenever he looked into her eyes, he saw something that made his heart skip, not the warm maternal love he expected, but something else entirely. Something that made him feel guilty for even thinking about it. Mama Adana was only 39, unusually young to have a 25-year-old son, but she had always explained that she married very young and had him when she was just 14. The math worked, barely, but there were things that never quite added up. She was too beautiful, too vibrant, too much like a contemporary rather than a mother figure. When they walked together in public, people often mistook them for husband and wife, and while Mama Adana would laugh it off, Emeka noticed she never seemed entirely uncomfortable with the assumption. Their home in Acacia was modest but comfortable, and they had lived there alone together since Emeka's father, or the man he believed to be his father, had died in a car accident when Emeka was 12. Papa Chitty had been a quiet man who worked long hours at the textile factory, and Emeka's memories of him were fleeting and distant. What he remembered most clearly was how Papa Chitty and Mama Adana rarely showed affection toward each other, living more like roommates than husband and wife. The first crack in Emeka's understanding of his world came on a humid Tuesday morning in July. He had returned home early from a business meeting that had been canceled, hoping to surprise Mama Adana with lunch from her favorite restaurant. Instead, he found her sitting at their small dining table, tears streaming down her face as she stared at a worn photograph he had never seen before. "Mama, what's wrong?" he asked, setting down the food and moving to her side. She quickly tried to hide the photograph, but not before Emeka caught a glimpse of it. The image showed a young woman who looked remarkably like Mama Adana, holding a baby. But what struck him most was the woman's expression. She looked terrified, not joyful like most new mothers. "It's nothing, my son," Mama Adana said, wiping her eyes. "Just old memories that sometimes hurt." But Emeka had seen enough to plant a seed of doubt. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction he'd ever had with the woman he called mother. The way she sometimes forgot to scold him when he came home late. The way she would blush when he complimented her cooking. The way she had never once mentioned wanting grandchildren or pressuring him to marry, unlike every other Nigerian mother he knew. Over the following weeks, Emeka began to pay closer attention to the details of their life together. He noticed that Mama Adana had no photographs of herself pregnant with him. She had no stories of his birth, no memories of his first steps or first words. When he asked about his extended family, she would become vague, claiming they had died or moved away to places unknown. The breaking point came when Emeka's business partner, Kimi, invited him to her family's traditional wedding ceremony in Enugu. Mama Adana had initially planned to accompany him, but on the morning of their departure, she suddenly claimed to be feeling unwell. "Go without me," she insisted, though she looked perfectly healthy. "I'll be fine here." Something in her tone made Emeka suspicious. Instead of leaving for Enugu, he pretended to go to work and then doubled back to watch their house from a distance. What he saw made his blood run cold. A man in his 60s, well-dressed and driving an expensive car, arrived at their house around noon. Mama Adana greeted him at the door, and from Emeka's hiding spot across the street, he could see them embracing, not the casual hug of old friends, but the desperate embrace of people who had been separated for too long. Emeka waited until the man left 3 hours later, then confronted Mama Adana directly. "Who was that man?" he demanded as soon as he walked through the door. Mama Adana went pale. "What man? I don't know what you're talking about." "The man who was here all afternoon. The one you hugged like you hadn't seen him in years." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the living room. Then Mama Adana's shoulders sagged, and she sank into her favorite chair. "Sit down, Emeka," she said quietly. "It's time you knew the truth." What she told him over the next hour shattered everything he thought he knew about his life. The man who had visited was Chief Okoro, a wealthy businessman from their home village in Anambra State. He was also Emeka's biological father. "But Papa Chitty," Emeka began. "Was my husband," Mama Adana finished. But he was not your father. And I am not your mother. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emeka felt the world spinning around him. I am your sister, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Your older sister. The story that tumbled out was one of family shame, desperate choices, and years of carefully constructed lies. Mama Adana, whose real name was Adana Okaro, had been 17 when their father, Chief Okoro, had begun visiting her room at night. She had been too young and too frightened to resist, and when she became pregnant, the family had been faced with a scandal that would have destroyed their reputation. Our mother had died the year before, Adana explained, unable to meet Emeka's eyes. Our father was powerful, respected. The shame of what he had done would have destroyed not just him, but our entire family's standing in the community. The solution they had devised was elaborate and cruel. Adana would marry Papa Chitty, a poor man who needed money and was willing to ask no questions. They would move to Lagos, far from anyone who knew their family. Adana would pretend to be Emeka's mother, and Papa Chitty would pretend to be his father. Chief Okaro would send money regularly to support them, but he would never publicly acknowledge his son. But why didn't you tell me when I became an adult? Emeka asked, his voice hollow. Because I was afraid, Adana admitted. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what you would think of me. Afraid of what you would think of our father. And because... She paused, her face crumpling. Because I had come to love you not just as a sister, but as something more. The admission hit Emeka like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. The strange looks, the inappropriate feelings he had been fighting, the way people assumed they were married. I fell in love with you, Emeka. I know it's wrong. I know it's impossible. But when you grew up to be so kind, so handsome, so different from our father, I couldn't help myself. Emeka stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. His mind was reeling, trying to process not just the revelation about his parentage, but the confession that his sister, the woman he had thought was his mother, had romantic feelings for him. And you? Adana asked quietly. Have you ever felt confused about your feelings toward me? Emeka closed his eyes, remembering all the times he had felt guilty about finding her attractive, about the dreams he had tried to suppress, about the way his heart raced when she smiled at him. Yes, he whispered. They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of their shared secret and forbidden feelings filling the room like smoke. What do we do now? Emeka finally asked. I don't know, Adana replied. Our father wants to see you. He's been asking for years, but I've always refused. He's getting old, and he wants to acknowledge you before he dies. He wants to give you your inheritance, your rightful place in the family. And what about us? What about this? Emeka gestured between them, encompassing 25 years of lies and confused emotions. I think, Adana said slowly, that you should meet him, learn about your real family, and then you should leave here, start fresh somewhere else. Find a wife, have children, live the life you deserve. What about you? I'll survive. I always have. But Emeka wasn't willing to simply walk away. The revelation had been shocking, but it had also freed him from years of guilt and confusion. He understood now why he had always felt different, why their relationship had never felt quite right in the traditional sense. 3 days later, they drove to Anambra State to meet Chief Okaro. The old man was waiting for them in his compound, a massive structure that spoke of decades of wealth and influence. When he saw Emeka, his eyes filled with tears. You look just like I did at your age, he said, embracing his son for the first time in 25 years. Over the course of the visit, Chief Okaro told Emeka about his other children, his legitimate sons and daughters who had grown up knowing they had a half-brother they were forbidden to acknowledge. He spoke of his regret, his guilt, and his desire to make amends. I will transfer ownership of 3 of my businesses to you, he said. You are my son, and you deserve your share of what I have built. But Emeka surprised everyone with his response. I don't want your money, he said firmly. I want something else. He turned to look at Adana, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the room. I want the truth to come out. I want our story to be told. I want Adana to be free from the shame and secrecy that has controlled her entire life. Chief Okaro's face went pale. Son, you don't understand what you're asking. The scandal is yours to bear, not hers, Emeka interrupted. She was a child when you abused her. She has spent her entire adult life protecting your reputation at the cost of her own happiness. What followed was the most difficult conversation any of them had ever had. Chief Okoro initially refused, then threatened, then finally broke down and wept. But Emeka was relentless, and eventually, the old man agreed to a public acknowledgement of his son and a formal apology to his daughter. The revelation sent shockwaves through their community. Some people were scandalized, others were sympathetic, but the truth was finally out. Adana was free to be seen as who she really was, not a young mother who had made difficult choices, but a victim who had sacrificed everything to protect her family's honor. As for Emeka and Adana, they made a decision that surprised everyone, including themselves. They would remain together, but not as mother and son, and not as lovers. They would be what they had always truly been. Brother and sister, partners in survival, two people who had found their way through impossible circumstances. Emeka moved his business to Anambra State, where he used his newfound wealth and status to build a life that honored both his past and his future. Adana, finally free from the weight of her secrets, began to heal. She enrolled in university, something she had never been able to do, and eventually became a counselor for other victims of abuse. They never married other people. They never had children, but they had each other, and they had the truth. And for two people who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of lies, that was enough. Years later, when people asked them about their unusual relationship, they would simply say that family is not always what it appears to be, and that love comes in many forms, some forbidden, some misunderstood, but all of them valid in their own way. The woman he thought was his mother was actually his sister, and in discovering that truth, they had both found a freedom neither had known was possible. Their story became a legend in their community, a reminder that the bonds of family are stronger than shame, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found in simply telling the truth.